Welcome to the Office of Hydraulic Engineering's presentation on highway encroachments on floodplains and the ODOT self-compliance process. Today we will briefly discuss what a regulated floodplain is and how highway encroachments are handled by ODOT through their self-compliance process. We will discuss what the definition is, some history of the regulation, and have a schematic that will show more detail and talk about the flood insurance program and the floodplain development. So first, what is a floodplain? It's any land susceptible to being inundated by floodwaters from any source. On the right, we can see where a river has gone over its banks and filled in some low areas, and in this case it's farmland, so everything we see here would be considered the floodplain. So regulations are at three levels. We have federal, state, and local. The federal regulations are shown here. We have the 44 CFR that deals with the management in the floodplain, and then the 23 CFR that deals with bridges, structures, and hydraulics in the floodplain. The state level regulation can be found in ORC 1521.13, and there are various localities that have their own regulations, and their standards cannot be below the minimum federal standards. They can be above, but not below. So the National Flood Insurance Program was authorized by Congress under the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. So the NFIP is managed by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. That is why we hear about FEMA zones, FEMA maps, and all that, because FEMA is regulating that. And what did they do? Well, they identified minimum floodplain development standards for communities to participate in the NFIP. And they tied that to the 1% AEP storm, or what was formerly known as the 100-year flood event, and that is called the base flood. When communities adopt the FEMA floodplain development regulations, then the property owners who are in the defined floodplain can purchase federal flood insurance. And the Federal Disaster Protection Act of 1973 requires mandatory purchase of flood insurance if you're within the regulated floodplain. So if a community participates in the NFIP, any property that is identified being in the floodplain has to purchase insurance. If they do not, then the community will be taken out of the NFIP. And FEMA produces map products that show the floodplain boundaries, and we will see those here in a couple of slides. So let's look at a regulated floodway schematic. This image is available in several FEMA publications, and this is also in our location design manual as figure 1006-1. But what it shows is, for the 1% flood, the boundary that will be inundated with that flood water. And that's the line AB in this particular schematic. But they also went and defined what a floodway and floodway fringe is. So we're assuming that at some point there will be development and fill put into the floodplain. So we've defined what the floodway is, that if you fill in the floodway fringe and you have a section left, you only have a 1-foot surcharge. And this was developed so that the water can be conveyed freely through this area. If we made this any smaller, the surcharge could increase. The flood insurance program developed what are called flood insurance rate map panels. On the left, we can see an older one, and they're still in use, but they will show the boundaries of the floodplain and then show the floodway as well. And these were developed with a hydraulic model. They put in cross sections, and you can see those in the firm panel as well. And then there's some elevations, but that helps a property owner determine if they are inside of the regulated floodplain. But because of modern technology, we also have what's called the National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer, and that can be found at the FEMA Flood Map Service Center. And you can move around. It's very dynamic, and you can find the location that you're looking at. And you can see in this particular image on the right, it is the image that you can see on the left as well, but we're zoomed in and you can see more detail, and you can actually make what are called fermettes with this and just be very localized where, in this case, where a structure is. So what is development in the floodplain? Well, the 44 CFR defined it, and it's any man-made change or to improved or unimproved real estate, and includes many things, including structures and excavation and paving. And so ODOT does a lot of those things. And because of the nature of our business, building bridges over waterways, we tend to be more often in the floodway and floodplain than most developers. When we encroach on these floodplains, we have to perform the ODOT self-compliance process. And we will discuss what some exceptions are, and then talk about the different FEMA zones and how we deal with those. All of this information is outlined in our location and design manual as well. So this is a streamlined process for transportation projects only, and it was developed by ODOT in conjunction with ODNR floodplain management. And it ensures that project development complies with federal, state, and local floodplain standards. And again, local standards may be more restrictive than FEMA minimum standards. Early coordination with floodplain coordinators is very important to the process. And obtaining a local permit is not required for ODOT-let projects. And proper documentation is necessary to maintain and verify compliance. So what are all of these documents that we need to do? Well, if you look in the L&D Appendix B in reproducible forms, we have an LD 50, 51, 52, and 53. So we have a no rise certification, a letter of compliance, letter of notification, and a letter of notification for a special flood hazard area exemption. This image shows all of those forms. Don't worry about if you can read it or not. They're all available, like the previous slide says, in the location design manual and online. And they're good templates, and they are what should be used when you're dealing with the local floodplain coordinators. So the Location Design Manual 2, or LD2, in section 1005.1.3 talks about the exceptions, and we will discuss that. And then section 1005.1.4 talks about the Zone A, AE, and AE with or without floodway. There are exceptions, and ODOT has determined that the following are exceptions. and you do not need to do a hydraulic analysis, and that's if you're doing bridge painting or if you're doing maintenance or replacement of a superstructure that is above the BFE. Also, if you have bridge or culvert maintenance that does not change the alignment, grade, or hydraulic capacity of the existing structure, then you are exempt as well. That you need to coordinate with the local floodplain administrator and provide the LD 53, which is the letter of notification of a special flood hazard area exemption. And so also if you have work involving a pole or post, like for a signal or a utility, then that would be considered insignificant and is also an exception. If you have a FEMA Zone A, now FEMA Zone A is an area that has a defined floodplain, but it hasn't gone through a high-level hydraulic analysis. Okay, so it has much less stringent requirements than a FEMA Zone AE, which we will see next. And what we need to do is send a letter of notification to the floodplain manager and then a letter of compliance after we have complied. And we need to do hydraulic calculations. And this limits the allowable water surface surcharge to 1 foot, or the local floodplain coordinator will tell you if theirs is less. And if there are any variances, they require coordination with the local floodplain coordinator. Now, there's also a FEMA Zone AE, which had a more detailed study, but without a floodway. So they haven't defined that area that if you fill in the fringe is required to pass the flow. So we need to provide an LD 52 letter of notification, a 51 letter of compliance, and then also have a hydraulic analysis. And it is very similar to the Zone A, where we generally can have a 1 foot rise or less depending on local rules. And then if there's a variance, we got to talk to the floodplain coordinator again. And this is the most common when we have a Zone AE that had a study done and a floodway is defined. It's more strict. And in this case, we have to send the LD 52 and 51 again and do a hydraulic analysis. And we want to stay out of the floodway if possible. And a no rise is preferred. And that meaning 0.00 feet. And typically the design should have no impact if we can do that. And if we're putting in a new structure, there's nothing we can really do. But if we're replacing a structure, we have to try really hard to put in something that creates no change, no rise. And then when that happens, we can supply this LD50, which is a no rise certification. And again, if you have a variance that you need to be processed, then we need to talk to the local floodplain coordinator. That's all for today. Thank you for watching.